So moving forward, another type of music production and genre that used the studio as instrument was reggae, and in particular dub. Jamaican engineers and producers such as Lee Scratch Perry and King Tubby used and abused the studio technology of the day to create some groundbreaking music and techniques that have become part of the staple of techniques engineers use today. In the pre-automation days, they would play the mixing console, creating dub mixes utilizing faders, mute buttons, panning, and auxiliary sounds to create dynamic and exciting mixes. In this video, I'm going to focus on the creative use of auxiliary sounds. So I have a 4-part drum ensemble. On the first track I've got some stabs, I've got a kick drum, clap and hi-hats. Because it's performance orientated, when I'm using on my auxiliary sounds, I always have them set up on switches so that it's just immediately on or off. And I find the subtlety of dialing in a particular setting to be less effective in a live performance. I want the impact to be immediate. I've got a couple of effects set up on my return channels. I've got a convolution reverb, which is using a spring reverb, which is typical of the type of reverbs that they were using in these studios. And on the other track, I've got a simple delay set up. So I'm using a MIDI controller. It's the evolution of the mixing console that we'll be using in the day to give me full control of my studio environment. So the percussion part is more like an ensemble. So any effects processing I apply there will be applied to all these elements, where I have it split up on the other channels. So I can have individual processing on my snare, my clap, or my hi-hats. Because these are all set up pre-fade, if I want, I can bring the volume down of a particular part and just be left with the effects. So bringing down the volume of the snare or clap and just hearing the effect. So it was typical also back in the day to chain a series of effects together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to route my reverb into a phaser, and my delay I'm going to route it into a second delay. But in the second delay I'm going to use a very short delay time, so we get comb filtering style effects. So another parameter or way of using the effect that became very popular as a result of dub techniques is excessive use of the feedback control. So here I have this assigned to my MIDI controller. And what the feedback control of course allows us to do is feed some of the output back into the input, and we get multiple sustaining decays. So I can have the repeats continue. I can even cut the original sound. And perform on the delay. Because the delays they were using would still be analog delays or tape-based delays, anytime you change the delay time, you're going to get a repitching of the effect, as compared with modern digital delays. When you change the delay time, you get a smooth transition between the echoes. When it's set to repitch, it simulates an analog delay, and you will get pitch shifting happening when you're altering the delay time. by using these techniques, you're actually performing the studio tools as they were an instrument, creating additional musical content to incorporate back into your track in real time. So sometimes the delays that they were using, they actually didn't have feedback control, but you can get a similar effect by feeding some of the output of the circuit back into it. And how you achieve this in the DAW is simply by turning up my send that the channel is on and feeding it back into itself. So you have to be careful because it can quickly get out of hand. The other thing that you can do is you can also feed effects into each other. So I can feed some of my delay into my reverb. I can get additional feedback happening by feeding the output of that back into itself. So I'm sending the delay into the reverb and sending the reverb back into the delay. Then I'm going to start adjusting the delay times. So of course I'm doing this manually like they would have been doing back in the day, but of course in modern DAWs you also have the option to use automation and modulation tools to print that performance into the mix. So to take this idea a step further, what I'm going to do is set up a signal path that allows me to use only the effects to generate new content. So I've got 4 return tracks here, and on each of these tracks I've got a variety of effects: delays, reverbs, frequency shifters, distortion type effects, flangers, and some modulation. Over on my first track here, I've just got a simple sound been generated by Dext, which is a simulation of the Yamaha DX7. So just a very simple note. I'm going to use this impulse as the input to my effects chain. So when I turn up the first send here, you can hear the effects that I've got set up on this chain here. A couple of delays been fed into a reverb, been fed into a ping pong delay. So what I'm going to do is the output of that, I'm going to send it into my second return. So in this one I've got a frequency shifter been fed into a reverb, been fed into an auto filter. So I'm going to continue this process. I'm going to send this return into the following one. So it's now going into an overdrive and a flanger. And I'll send the output of that into the next auxiliary, which on this one I've got a simple delay into a chorus, into a vinyl distortion. And because it's the end of the chain that I'm going to use, I've got a compressor set up here. So often when you're working in this way, levels and feedback can get out of control. So it's always useful to have some sort of dynamics like compressor or limiter at the end of the chain to catch any explosive occurrences that might happen. So in order to keep the processing continuing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed some of the output of the last return back into the input of the first one. So by turning this up here, I'll send some of this signal back into the first one. And you can hear we're getting some feedback there. So by carefully dialing in the right amount on this send here, I should be able to get the processing continuing without continually needing our trigger sound. So when the circuit is feeding back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to alter some of the settings of the effects that we have in the chain. So currently we've got the output of this return being fed into this one, and fed into this one, and fed into this one, and then sent back again. You can also do various routing options within here. So what I'll do is I'll send some of this return back into the one before it. So we can get even more feedback happening within the circuit. Or I could even send this return straight to the last one in the chain. So there's kind of less energy in the circuit there because this filter taking a lot of the strength out of the signal. Keeping a check there, just not let the feedback get out of control. That's why I have that compressor at the end of the chain. Sometimes when you're working this way, unpredictable things can happen, happy accidents. And often when you're working like this, it's a good idea to be recording the output back into your DAW so you can capture these happy accidents for further resampling and incorporation into your mix. So I haven't triggered the original note for a long time. And we have this sustaining feedback loop happening where I can experiment with generating various timbres and textures. So once you have this set up, you can actually practice this like you would an instrument and finding the sweet spots that can bring out various interesting textures. Them onto repitch so that when I change them I'll get a variation. Vary speed happening. So that circuit will continue to feedback as long as the energy is being maintained. So if I was to reduce, say, my filter here, imagine that the circuit will die off. So there's a lot of creative applications of this technique, no matter what genre you're working in. And we owe a thanks to the dub producers in Jamaica of the 70s for bringing these sort of techniques to modern music production. So throughout this course, we looked at various techniques and concepts of using the studio as an instrument. A lot of these techniques are quite rudimentary, given that they were first introduced in the 50s, 60s and 70s, but often using a reduced set of techniques can produce some interesting results brought about through the limitations. This has been Alan Gleeson. Please subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel for further tutorials.